Ball catchers. That's it. That's what we're talking about in this video. Ball catchers. Yo, Headliner Nation, what is going on? Start and sit videos are officially here. It's week 1, and in this video today, we're going to be breaking down our start and sit analysis for the wide receiver position. And in week 1, we are working a day in advance, so running backs have already come out. This video will be linked to that one at the end, so make sure you finish this one, and then you can hop over to running backs if you've missed it. And just as a side note, for the rest of the season, running backs and tight ends will be coming out on Tuesday, with quarterbacks and wide receivers coming out on Wednesdays. And if you missed my start and sit video for running backs, then let me take a moment to explain how our start and sit videos work. Because in 2024, we have revamped the start and sit process to give you a more streamlined approach to hearing our analysis. For every single matchup, we're going to be taking a look at the defense that each player will be facing. And we're going to rank that defense based on the amount of fantasy points they've given up, the amount of touchdowns they've given up, and the amount of yards that they have given up to that position. If you see an eggplant emoji on that matchup, that means it's a great matchup. But then we take it a step further by designating a risk factor. Our start and sit shows aren't about just you start this guy and you sit that guy. It's about helping you make the best start decision possible, because it depends on the player, your roster size, your league scoring. Lots of different things go into play on who you should be starting and sitting each week. So we're going to give you a risk factor on what that guy could potentially do. You could have low risk, medium risk, and high risk. And if a guy's a high risk, it doesn't mean that you should sit him. It just means that he could definitely be in for a rough week, but maybe he still has a pretty decent ceiling. We're also testing out the YouTube algorithm. We're trying to get as many people to hit the like button within the first 3 minutes of our video as possible. So if you haven't hit it yet, why not? But now it's time to hop into the analysis, and we're gonna kick it off with Thursday Night Football. Baltimore heads to Kansas City, where the defending Super Bowl champions try to start 2024 off a little quicker than they did 2023. Last season, I don't think Kansas City got enough love for how good their defense was. They were inside the top 5 of fewest fantasy points, yards, and touchdowns allowed to the wide receiver position. Zay Flowers, who likely is the wide receiver 1 this season for Baltimore, definitely has the potential for a big day. Remember last year in the playoffs, he had 115 receiving yards on 5 receptions. But that's just it. He needed some big plays, and that will be the same thing this week against Kansas City. Will we see consistent production where he's putting together 6, 7, or 8 catches? Probably not. We're looking at that 4 to 5 catch area, and my hope is just like in the playoffs, he has some big catches to really push those numbers and his ceiling up. And for as good as Kansas City was against the pass last year, so was Baltimore. Baltimore was inside the top 8 of fewest fantasy points, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns allowed to wide receivers. Everybody is going to be watching Xavier Worthy, and I think everybody is excited to see what his speed will translate to this year in this Kansas City Chiefs offense. Now, no Marquise Brown. We're going to have to wait a little bit longer for him on the outside as well. But here in week 1, Xavier Worthy is probably going to be a little too big play dependent for me. Absolutely, the dude could catch a 50 or 60 yard touchdown and he'll be fine for the day. But he also could only have like 3 catches for 40 yards, and unfortunately, that's not going to be enough. Xavier Worthy has the upside. Rashee Rice has the floor, and Rashee Rice more than likely will be 1 and 2 with Travis Kelce in terms of targets this week. He'll either be right in front of him or right behind him, but Rashee Rice, much better floor. He doesn't have the playmaking ability that Xavier Worthy does, so the ceiling won't be there, but in PPR leagues, he's a whole lot safer. In half PPR leagues, he's definitely a guy that should at least make his way into a low-end wide receiver 2 or flex conversation. How about Green Bay at Philadelphia? Philadelphia may be the home team, but they're going to be down in Brazil kicking off on Friday night of week 1. And for the Green Bay Packers, this could end up being a good matchup. Last season, Philadelphia's secondary was terrible, especially down the stretch. They couldn't stop the pass to save their lives. They had one of the worst secondaries in all of football. But they spent the majority of this offseason making sure that that was not the case, strengthening their secondary not only in the draft, but by bringing CJ Gardner-Johnson back as well. And as a Lions fan, that dude can kick rocks. Philadelphia's secondary last season allowed the second most fantasy points, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns to the wide receiver position. But it isn't going to be easy this week for Green Bay to put up numbers just like that. And coupled with the fact that we don't know who the primary wide receiver is, all of these guys are going to carry a high risk for me. It may take us a few weeks to find out if there is a dominant wide receiver one on this Green Bay roster, or if this is more of a best ball roster, where any of these guys could go off on any given week. And in week one, somebody obviously could have a really good game. But until I get a chance to see it a little bit more consistently, because of where we drafted Green Bay wide receivers, we're not really in a position where we have to start one. I would rather take a shot with somebody with a little bit of a safer floor this week until we know more about how these wide receivers are going to shake out. I do think Philadelphia ends up winning this game, and I think their offense is going to look way better than it did down the stretch last season. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the Green Bay defense, especially in the passing game, it revolves around Jaire Alexander, and more than likely Alexander will end up being on A.J. Brown. Now, A.J. Brown is big enough, strong enough, and fast enough to beat Jaire Alexander. There aren't too many matchups with A.J. Brown that I get super worried about. He's still going to be a pretty safe floor for me. I think he sees a good amount of targets, and even if Alexander limits him and doesn't allow a huge play, he should still have a pretty decent floor to give you good numbers. Devontae Smith is a little bit more of a risk for me because he always is in this offense, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have the higher ceiling than A.J. Brown. This week, Devontae Smith could absolutely end up outscoring A.J. Brown. I think his ceiling is higher than A.J. Brown, but I also feel like for targets, A.J. Brown is going to get the looks before Devontae Smith does. So Smith is going to be really reliant on that big play this week. If he gets it, fantasy value should be good. If he doesn't get it, I don't know if he gets the volume to help prop his floor up. Pittsburgh at Atlanta is going to bring us a matchup of two potential breakout candidates at the wide receiver position for 2024. But both of them have some question marks at the quarterback position in week one, but for different reasons. Let me explain. George Pickens' upside lies with Russell Wilson. And what type of a game plan does Arthur Smith have drawn up? Last season against the Atlanta Falcons, it was all about the big play and the touchdown against their secondary. They did a pretty decent job of limiting overall yards. But every once in a while, they would give up that big play and wide receivers would find a touchdown. That is where you would reach your ceiling against them. But what type of quality targets will he have in week one? That's going to be the big question. He should be the top target on this team. But is Russell Wilson going to be the guy to get him those targets? What if things with Wilson aren't going well in the first half? Do we see Justin Fields? I just feel like right now with George Pickens, there's going to be some risk associated with the game plan and the quarterback. And there are some similarities there with Drake London. Drake London should be the number one target on his team. But Kirk Cousins is coming back from a torn Achilles. He hasn't been in live game action since that injury happened. And now he needs to face TJ Watt in the pass rush of the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's no easy task. And if they are getting in the backfield and Kirk Cousins is moving around, how well does he actually move around in the pocket? Can he extend plays right now? How healthy is he? More than likely, he is healthy. But even when you're coming back with a serious injury like that, it takes a while to get 100% up here mentally. And for Kirk Cousins, trying to extend the play and move around in the pocket may not be his best attribute in week one. Because of that, it could bring some less quality targets to Drake London. He may lead the team in targets, but how many of those will be catchable this week? That is where his ceiling gets a little gray. Arizona and Buffalo is going to allow us our first look at two of the top wide receivers drafted in this past year's class. Marvin Harrison Jr. was the first wide receiver taken. Keon Coleman may be a little bit under the radar, but Buffalo feels like he has top wide receiver potential in their offense. And while Buffalo did a good job last season of keeping wide receivers out of the end zone, they still gave up quite a bit of receiving yards, and the volume should go towards Marvin Harrison Jr. at the wide receiver position. He's likely going to be the top target almost every single week. Trey McBride may sneak in there, but in week 1, I'm loving his current line over on Underdog. I'm going to go ahead and go with higher on 5.5 receptions currently listed over on Underdog. And if you want to join in on all of the pick'ems that we do this season, make sure you head on over to Underdog right now and use code word headliners when you get signed up. You're going to get a deposit match of up to $1,000. And Underdog is also going to give you a special pick'em just for signing up with our code word that's almost guaranteed to hit. And for week 1 of the NFL season, they have specials rolling out every single day. So right now is the time to get signed up. Now, Keon Coleman is going to bring some risk this week. In the preseason, you could see that some of the separation issues that were a question coming out of college are still going to be an issue here at the NFL level. At least for right now. He obviously is going to get better, and he obviously has a chance to take some of those flaws and turn them into positives. But this season could see some inconsistencies in his gameplay if he's not able to separate from those top cornerbacks. Arizona, their defense was hit and miss last season. Basically missed more than not, especially when it came to passing the ball. Teams could run on them no matter what. They gave up quite a few touchdowns to wide receivers last season, though. So even if the yards are not there from Coleman this week, hopefully he's able to find the end zone if you need to start him. Tennessee and Chicago both added new wide receivers to their core this past offseason. Calvin Ridley signed a free agent deal with Tennessee, while the Chicago Bears went out and traded for Keenan Allen. Last season, Chicago's defense ranked 16th in receptions allowed to wide receivers, but they allowed the 9th fewest receiving yards to wide receivers. That's because they limited the big play. They kept the ball in front of them and they made tackles after the catch. Calvin Ridley, he thrives on the big play. Will Levis, he thrives on the big play. And DeAndre Hopkins has been banged up all training camp. So right now, we really got to focus in this week on what ends up being the best path to targets. It may not be Will Levis to Calvin Ridley. Because they limit those big plays and Chicago keeps the ball in front of their defenders, Calvin Ridley may not have a shot at anything down the field. But if DeAndre Hopkins doesn't play this week for whatever reason, then we would have an opportunity to bump up Calvin Ridley's target share, making him a medium risk instead of a high risk. But if DeAndre Hopkins does play, he remains a high risk and DeAndre Hopkins becomes a medium risk, mainly because of the injury. But he does fit better into the game plan to beat the Chicago Bears, and that's working over the intermediate part of the field where Hopkins is best. Last season, the Tennessee Titans allowed the 3rd most receptions and 6th most receiving yards to wide receivers. So go ahead and lock me in for the low risk of DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. Both of these guys should absolutely feast this week. And Rome Odunze, if he can find a big play to the end zone, should also end up having a solid day. But he's going to be far more dependent on the big play and the touchdown because the volume likely goes to Keenan Allen and DJ Moore instead, giving them much safer floors, but still really nice upside because of their big play ability. There are a ton of questions for me about the wide receivers in the New England and Cincinnati matchup. I mean, first and foremost, who's even going to be the main wide receiver for New England? They've got like 900 wide receiver threes on their roster. I just feel like it's way too risky, even in what could end up being a solid matchup for them, to try and pick one guy this week. Will one of the rookies end up separating themselves? Jalen Polk was a guy whose name came up a ton in training camp. Javon Baker, he's got huge big play potential. But KJ Osborne, the veteran, he's going to be there. Demario Douglas at times last season was pretty good. But Jacoby Brissett hasn't been that good this preseason. Oh, and by the way, their offensive line has been even worse. Right now, when it comes to the New England wide receivers, we're just out until we know who we can potentially rely on for the targets. For Cincinnati, I would love to make Ja'Marr Chase a low risk. I would love to make T. Higgins a low risk. But there's even more questions on that sideline right now. First off, let's just go ahead and mention that New England's defense is killer. For as bad as their offense has been, their defense has been that good. Last season, they ranked in the top 3 of fewest receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. They were also good at limiting the big play, ranking 14th in receptions, but 19th in receiving yards. Now, Ja'Marr Chase is always going to carry huge upside because we know the dude can make a play from anywhere on the field and take it to the house. And he's Joe Burrow's guy as well. But here's the issue. I already mentioned it. Number 1, Joe Burrow. How good is that wrist? How comfortable is he right now? And will he be able to step back into the pocket and be the same Joe Burrow prior to that wrist injury? Number 2, Ja'Marr Chase still isn't practicing. He's basically said, hey, I want a new contract and I'm not going to practice until I get it. Oh, by the way, T. Higgins is also frustrated with his contract. So now your top 2 wide receivers are upset because they're not getting paid the way that they feel they should be. There was even some concerns that Ja'Marr Chase would miss week 1. At this point, I'm going to assume that's probably not going to happen. But I'm not going to know more either until later in the week. So make sure you check out our ranking show later in the week so we can update you on whether or not Chase is going to be in. I know for a fact there's going to be some disagreement in the comment section of this video, and it's going to be based around the Houston wide receivers. You're going to see medium risk for all these guys, and somebody out there is going to be triggered that I don't have at least one of them as low risk. Let me be very frank with you, and it's the same stance that I've had all off season. Will this be a very good offense? Absolutely. Will it be one of the best offenses in all of football? Absolutely. Will C.J. Stroud be one of the best quarterbacks in all of football? Absolutely. Will you be able to tell me on a weekly basis who the wide receiver 1 will be for this team? No, you won't be able to. And that's why they all carry some sort of risk every single week. These guys are best ball players because when you draft from this roster, from the wide receiver position, you're going to need to be able to know when these guys are going to go off and when they're not going to go off. And last year, it was kind of the same thing when Tank Dell and Nico Collins were both healthy. There would be some games where it would be Dell and not Collins. There'd be other games where it's Collins and not necessarily Dell. But now we've added Stefon Diggs to that mix as well. It's going to be really, really tough from a redraft perspective to try and pick the right wide receiver in any given week. If you start Nico Collins, he's absolutely going to win maybe 8 weeks for you this season, but he also may lose 8 weeks for you as well, because that's going to be a week where Dell or Diggs or maybe both of them end up exploding and Nico Collins just doesn't see the targets. So no, I'm probably never going to tell you to sit any of these guys unless somebody's hampered by an injury or unless there's a really tough matchup that we know that somebody is going to probably be limited in terms of upside. In week 1, we're going to start all of them, but at the end of the week, we'll have to discuss which one of them let us down. Does Michael Pittman have the same upside as Nico Collins, Tank Dell, or Stefon Diggs? No, he doesn't, but he does carry a much safer floor. And that's why he's a low risk for me here. Because when you take a look at Michael Pittman, he's definitely going to be the alpha wide receiver in this offense. He's going to be the guy that will see the most targets throughout the season and on a weekly basis. But he's not a big play receiver. We saw that last season. He is a controlled wide receiver over the middle of the field and on the boundaries that's sure-handed and picks up those yards for you. Not super explosive, not going for 60 or 70-yard touchdowns, but he's getting the job done with the amount of targets that he gets. And that makes him a low risk because more than likely you drafted him as your wide receiver 2. And he's going to give you at least wide receiver 2 numbers. Now, Houston's defense did a really good job of limiting touchdowns last season, but the big plays were something that would catch them off guard as well. Because even though they allowed the 11th fewest receptions to wide receivers, they allowed the 12th most receiving yards. So for Michael Pittman this week, maybe there is an opportunity to break a couple of extra big plays. But more than likely, if you said, Kyle, he's going to get 10 targets, I would say he catches 8 of them for like 80 yards. And if he does that, he's not probably going to be a wide receiver 1, but he's a super solid safe wide receiver 2. Does Jacksonville and Miami turn into a fantasy dream of a shootout? Or does Miami's defense put Trevor Lawrence and Jacksonville back in their place and Miami walks away with a huge win in week 1? Now, the consensus coming out of Jacksonville is that Trevor Lawrence looks way comfortable and way more prepared this season than what he did last year. And part of that could be because of the wide receivers that he has available to him now. You still have Christian Kirk, but now you have Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU and Gabe Davis on the other side to really stretch the field. And I love Christian Kirk. The last 2 seasons, this guy was a sleeper for us here at the Fantasy Headliners, and he ended up working out just fine. But this year, I'm completely off board. And one of the main reasons why is because this preseason, once again, when they run out in 2 wide receiver sets, Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas are the guys that go out there. Christian Kirk is really only going out for 3 wide receiver sets. So if we limit how much he's on the field, that becomes an issue. So here in week 1, I definitely think we need to take Christian Kirk with a grain of salt and try to figure out what Jacksonville plans on doing with him overall. If we do see him out on the field more for 2 wide receiver sets, perfect. We're Gucci moving forward with him. But if they don't, that's where it becomes an issue. So he's going to be a high risk for me this week. But because there is always the potential of a shootout going up against Miami, give me Brian Thomas to have a little bit less risk because of his big playability and because of what he does after the catch. Gabe Davis could end up having a big play here or there as well, but it's Brian Thomas to me that has the ability to be way more consistent. Now, Jacksonville did a pretty good job last season of limiting receiving yards to the wide receivers. But they didn't do a good job of keeping wide receivers out of the end zone, allowing the 5th most touchdowns to wide receivers last year. So why don't we go ahead and lock in a nice underdog pick'em for Tyreek Hill this week? I'm absolutely including an underdog pick'em of Tyreek Hill scoring a touchdown. He's got big potential, obviously, in this matchup, but if Jacksonville's defense has just as much trouble keeping guys out of the end zone as they did last year, Tyreek Hill is one of the safest bets to score a touchdown every single week. Miami has a ton of potential to put up a whole lot of points. And if that happens, if Tyreek Hill doesn't find the end zone, it would be one of the craziest things to happen in week 1. I know Carolina would love to get off to a fast start this season, but playing on the road in New Orleans probably wasn't exactly what they wanted. And they're going to have all the confidence in the world to go in there and win this football game, because that's what you do as a football team, especially at the beginning of any year. But from my standpoint, and really anybody else's standpoint, I don't know if they even stand a chance. Now, I think New Orleans defense is probably going to be like middle of the road. I don't think it's going to be elite, and I don't think it's going to be bad. They have some good pieces on the defensive line. They've got some good pieces in the secondary. But is Bryce Young going to have enough time to throw? And even if New Orleans gets up by a couple of scores and Carolina has to throw the entire game, what are going to be the quality of those targets for Deontay Johnson, Xavier Leggett, or even Adam Thielen? That's where things get to be really, really shaky this week. We know that those 3 wide receivers can play football. Bryce Young in college could play football, but unfortunately at the NFL level, for multiple reasons, he hasn't really flashed it as of yet. I don't think Carolina is a lost cause, but this really isn't the matchup if you're looking to build a lot of confidence at the beginning of your season. Last season, Carolina's defense ranked inside the top 5 of fewest fantasy points, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns allowed to the wide receiver position. but maybe those numbers were a little skewed. One of the biggest reasons why is because you could run the football all over Carolina, and that's what teams were doing. They were running the football, they were being successful. Carolina's offense wasn't putting up a fight, so they just kept running the football and running out the clock. But one of the reasons why I can't go with Chris Olave as a low-risk wide receiver this week is just because there still disconnections inside this New Orleans offense. We saw it last season a lot. They just continued to send Chris Olave on go routes down the field. Derek Carr would throw it up. Chris Olave would be frustrated because it was nowhere near him. Wash, rinse, repeat. I mean, it was the same thing over and over. Do they have a better game plan this year? Do they utilize Chris Olave a lot better? Put him in the slot, run some intermediate routes, stop sending him on go routes all the time. Use Rashid Shaheed and A.T. Perry for that. A.T. Perry, for me, has the most ceiling this week because I definitely could see him with a huge touchdown going up against Carolina. While Chris Olave has a little bit of a safer floor for me, but I don't necessarily think the big play comes for him this week, and because of that, his ceiling just nearly isn't as high. Last season, Justin Jefferson was elite, even with Nick Mullins and other guys at the quarterback position. I'm sorry to say it, you may hate Sam Darnold, but I can't see Sam Darnold being a worse connection than what Nick Mullins was for Justin Jefferson last season. And given the matchup here, I'm going to take Justin Jefferson against the New York Giants to be just fine. Now, Brian Burns is with the New York Giants now, so their pass rush is going to be a little bit more enhanced. Their secondary, you can get away with some bigger plays there. They have a good secondary, but there's still some questions and some growth that needs to be answered there. Justin Jefferson, unless you're an elite cornerback, is going to win a majority of the time. Now, is Sam Darnold going to be able to make Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison elite options? Probably not. Jordan Addison is going to carry some risk in this matchup as well. But Justin Jefferson, if you drafted him, you're starting him in week 1 and you're feeling pretty darn good about it. Not even Daniel Jones can mess up this matchup for Malik Nabers. Can he? I mean, Minnesota last season, their defense ranked inside the top 5 of most fantasy points, most receiving yards, and most receiving touchdowns allowed to the wide receiver position. So you would think a defense that really isn't that much more improved over last season, their pass rush, yeah, it's still going to be okay. They've still got some athleticism as well, but the cornerback situation isn't exactly fluid. And Malik Nabers is obviously a really good talent. In week 1, as long as Daniel Jones can hit him for some big plays, Malik Nabers should have a pretty big day. And given the fact that he probably leads this team in targets, he probably has a super safe floor to go with it as well. There may be a lot of question marks the rest of the season when it comes to the connection between Gardner Minshew and Davante Adams. In fact, Davante Adams lasting the rest of the season in Las Vegas, to me, I don't think it ends up happening. But this week against the Los Angeles Chargers, I think they could end up being okay. Now, last season, Los Angeles' defense, not great. They allowed the 4th most fantasy points and the 4th most touchdowns to wide receivers last season, but they were also banged up. It feels like that's been kind of the MO for the Chargers defense recently. Banged up, injured, not 100%. Well, it looks like they're going to be 100% here in week 1. Davante Adams should still have a really solid day though. In fact, I'm willing to run over to Underdog right now and put in a slip with Davante Adams going higher than 6 receptions this week. I definitely could see him coming close to double-digit receptions. I think he's definitely going to be the main target and looked at the most. And it doesn't really matter if the Chargers are 100% or not. They cannot play with Davante Adams. Very few people can. The big question will be Gardner Minshew. Can he give him quality targets? If you wanted me to guess who's going to see the most targets in week 1 for the LA Chargers, it's going to be Ladd McConkey, and that is who I would target this week. Josh Palmer, I still feel like has the best chance to be the wide receiver 1 on this team because of his big playability. But I also believe that we should be chasing safe floors in week 1. And by doing that, we would go with Ladd McConkey over Josh Palmer. Josh Palmer could have a huge play. He could end up having a big touchdown. That is absolutely possible. But Ladd McConkey should end up seeing more targets than him this week. And if that happens, it gives him a safer floor and makes him less risky. Denver at Seattle will be featuring two of the best young cornerbacks in all the NFL, with Devin Witherspoon and Patrick Surtain. And that could end up causing nightmares for our fantasy wide receivers. I need to list everybody on Denver as a high risk this week. Number one, Bo Nix looked pretty good in the preseason, but that doesn't mean it's just going to translate to the regular season either. And really, do we think that he's going to be throwing the ball 35 times this week? I highly doubt it. Courtland Sutton going up against Devin Witherspoon? No thanks. I'm not on board with that. And we have no idea who the number 2 wide receiver would end up being as of right now. They walked away from Tim Patrick, and they've got several other options. And I can't even list everybody on this start and sit spreadsheet right now, because it would make absolutely no sense. They literally have like 5 different guys that you could consider as their wide receiver too. There are some questions that need to be answered, and the only guy that we know of for sure, Courtland Sutton, has an awful matchup against Witherspoon. DK Metcalf on the other side is going to be matched up against Patrick Surtain. Now, DK Metcalf could still end up having a decent day, but Surtain could lock him down for the most part, and then we're caught hoping that Metcalf either scores or has 1 or 2 big plays to help make the day. It definitely could be some inconsistent targets. And Tyler Lockett, I don't even really know what's going on with Tyler Lockett right now. He's been banged up for the majority of training camp, and there is still no absolute word on whether or not he's going to be available. So if you're looking for the riskiest option with the highest upside, it's absolutely DK Metcalf. If you're looking for the best floor this weekend, though, with the highest amount of target potential, that's going to be Jackson Smith-Njigba. Dallas and Cleveland may end up being a defensive slugfest, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be a whole lot of fun to watch. Dallas, obviously, with CeeDee Lamb, we're going to be starting him. And I'm going to put him as a low risk, even if it ends up being a tougher matchup, because he's the number 1 target on this team. And we know that Dallas is going to throw the football. The hope is that maybe CeeDee Lamb breaks a couple of big plays, and if he does, his ceiling gets higher and higher and higher. But right now, his ceiling is a little bit on the lower side with a really nice floor this week. The dude could end up seeing double-digit targets easy. And if he catches almost all of those, he definitely cements himself as a high-end wide receiver too. And that big play or touchdown to go with it pushes him way up into wide receiver 1 status. Now in 2023, Cleveland did allow the 3rd fewest receiving yards, and they did a pretty good job of keeping the big plays from beating them. But that's what makes CeeDee Lamb so good, is because he can take a bunch of intermediate routes and turn them into big plays just like that, and you have no idea what happened. So while he doesn't need that 60-yard pass down the field to make his day, he could take a 15-yard pass and build it up into 30 yards, do that several times. Now all of a sudden CeeDee Lamb is over 100 yards before you know it, and he's made his fantasy day that much sweeter. Amari Cooper is going to be looking for that revenge game against Dallas here in week 1. But it's not all on Amari Cooper to make that happen, because Deshaun Watson, since he was traded to Cleveland, hasn't looked great. And now he's going to be going up against one of the best defenses in all of football from last season, that even though they lost Dan Quinn, should still be very, very good this season. And hoping and praying for Deshaun Watson to get the job done so Amari Cooper can have a big day, I just feel like we're rolling dice at this point and hoping that we hit 7s multiple times in a row. It just feels like luck may not be on our side with Deshaun Watson as Amari Cooper's quarterback. And we've added some competition for targets as well. Jerry Jeudy is there. You still have David Njoku. Jerome Ford could be utilized very well in the passing game this week. Elijah Moore. For me personally, when I take a look at Amari Cooper, we know he's the wide receiver 1 on this team. We know know he's the best wide receiver on this team. Maybe he gets lined up with Trayvon Diggs this week. If that happens, that ends up hurting his ceiling a little bit. There's just a lot of things working against him right now that makes him a riskier start when and if you need to put him in your lineup. Washington and Tampa Bay will feature one of my most sought after fantasy picks from this offseason. But starting with Washington, Terry McLaurin should end up having himself a day with Jaden Daniels. Now that Jahan Dotson is gone, there really isn't a wide receiver 2 that is established right now. You have Dyami Brown, who was showing some really nice things in training camp and was one of the reasons why they traded Jahan Dotson. You also have Luke McCaffrey, who may end up being in the slot to start. But Terry McLaurin is the locked-in #1 target on this team right now. And Tampa Bay, they had some issues stopping the pass last season, and unfortunately, their secondary isn't any stronger than what it was last year. So Terry McLaurin absolutely could end up having himself one heck of a day. But let me go ahead and lock in one of my favorite picks from this offseason. Mike Evans is my Manscaped must-start player at the wide receiver position here in Week 1. And if you need to get yourself taken care of before games kick off on Week 1, head on over to manscaped.com and use code word headliners20 to get 20% off of your order and free shipping. Manscaped has all the tools that you need to make sure your significant other lists you as a must start every single day. Last season, Washington allowed the most fantasy points, the most touchdowns, and the most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. And now you're going to get Mike Evans and Chris Godwin this week going up against you. Their secondary and their defense is probably going to be one of the worst in football again this season. Now, Dan Quinn is a mastermind when it comes to the defensive side of the ball, but he doesn't have enough tools in Washington right now, and that's going to be the biggest issue for him. In fact, I like the matchup so much from Mike Evans here in Week 1 that I'm going to head on over to Underdog and I'm going to take the over on his current line of 69.5 receiving yards. If you want to go ahead and throw in a touchdown, you could throw in a touchdown. If you want to take an over on the 4.5 receptions, you can do it. Mike Evans could have himself a huge day here in Week 1 and absolutely return value to fantasy owners right away, and I'm here for it. 3 of the best wide receivers in all of football will be on display for the big wild card rematch when LA heads back to Detroit for Week 1 on Sunday Night Football. And Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua should both end up being low risk this week. Matthew Stafford is going to throw the ball. We know Detroit's defense, they stop the run. They bottle it up, and Kyren Williams could have himself an okay day just like he did at the end of last season against Detroit. And Detroit's secondary is completely revamped. They've made a trade, they addressed the position within their draft, and they feel like their secondary is going to be a whole lot better. But even as a Lions fan, sometimes I got to see it to believe it. And this is a really tough passing matchup to begin the season. So I'll go ahead and take Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua to have really good floors with more than enough targets this week, and one of them likely ends up finding the end zone as well. And for the Detroit Lions, I'm not expecting Jameson Williams' breakout week here this week against the LA Rams. LA also had a tough time stopping the pass last season. They did a decent job of limiting touchdowns allowed to wide receivers, but fantasy points and yards were still more to be had against this team. And missing Aaron Donald in the middle of this defensive line is going to affect how much pressure they potentially get on Jared Goff. Now, when you pressure Jared Goff, he's calm, he's collective, and he still makes the plays. But you definitely don't want to give him enough time to just sit in the pocket and let Jameson Williams get loose, or let Sam Laporta or Amon-Ra St. Brown do what they do best. And don't forget about Jahmyr Gibbs out of the backfield. Amon-Ra St. Brown wins from everywhere on the field. There's no nickel corners that are good enough to contain him. He's definitely a mismatch against linebackers, and if you shove him out wide against top cornerbacks, he still finds a way to beat them as well. Give me some Amon-Ra St. Brown to have a super solid day here in Week 1. The marquee matchup of the week on Monday Night Football is the New York Jets and the San Francisco 49ers. There are a ton of storylines in this matchup, but Garrett Wilson for the New York Jets should end up having the best day of any wide receiver on the field. I could definitely lock him in for 10 or more targets this week and a huge fantasy day going up against this San Francisco secondary. Not only do I think a huge target day could raise his floor to one of the safest floors of any of the top wide receivers this week, but I also think he has the potential to find the end zone. And if he does that, you could almost certainly lock him into a top 5 week. He absolutely could potentially end up getting shut down. But really, this secondary for San Francisco isn't equipped to handle what Garrett Wilson is going to bring to the table this week. Really, it's one of those instances where you just try to limit the damage of Garrett Wilson instead of trying to shut him down. They're going to have multiple guys on him, but Garrett Wilson's going to be moving all over the field. He's going to be outside, and he's also going to be in the slot, and that's where he becomes most dangerous. And for Aaron Rodgers, he's going to have the San Francisco line on him pretty quick. Coming back from that Achilles injury, trying to move around in the pocket, it might take him a little bit of time to get comfortable once again. The best way for him to just get rid of the ball is to give Garrett Wilson some nice short intermediate routes, let him do some work after the catch, and let the ball get out of Rodgers' hand quickly. Last season, the New York Jets defense allowed the fewest fantasy points, fewest touchdowns, and fewest receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. They are the definition of a shutdown defense, especially with Sauce Gardner out at corner, who more than likely will end up seeing a lot of Brandon Ayuk this week. Now, Brandon Ayuk got his deal done, but that doesn't change the fact that he has sat out basically all of training camp. Deebo, however, is the much better matchup to take a look at here this week. Now, Trent Williams is getting his deal done and he will be back. Christian McCaffrey, as of this recording, has returned to practice. So, San Francisco should be at 100%. But Deebo is the guy that makes this offense go. When he's healthy and he's on the field, this offense operates at his very best. They're going to do a lot of things with him out of the backfield. He's going to be the key to San Francisco winning this week. If he has a really big day and they're able to game plan to keep him away from the top players on the New York Jets defense and allow him to operate in open space, San Francisco absolutely ends up winning this game. Deebo for me is a low risk because of how he will be utilized in this game plan. Yo, Headliner Nation, there you have it. My start and sit analysis for the wide receiver position here in week 1. I already asked you to hit that like button at the beginning of the video. If you forgot to do it or just didn't do it, please do it now, especially if you are enjoying the content. And leave us a comment down below. Let us know how many fantasy championships did you win last season? And if you didn't win one, let us know how confident you are that you're going to win one this year. I'll end up pinning a comment for you guys to respond to. But for now, I'm going to go finish up tight ends and quarterbacks. Everybody have a great rest of the day, stay safe, and stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.